The world that produces Homelander does not begin in chaos. It begins in order, a polished order, a world arranged around spectacle, reassurance, and controlled awe. The skyline is clean. The flags are bright. The crowds know where to look. Power has been carefully staged as something protective, something benevolent, something that belongs at the center of the frame. Nothing appears broken at first glance. The foundations feel stable because they were engineered to feel that way. In this world, power is not earned through struggle or negotiated through shared limits. It is presented as a given, an inheritance without lineage, a force without history. Homelander stands at the center of this arrangement not as a man, but as a solution already decided upon. He is not introduced through growth or consequence. He arrives fully formed, framed by applause and institutional trust. The audience never sees the labor that would normally justify authority. They see only the result, immaculate and unquestioned. The atmosphere around him is one of elevation. He occupies the vertical axis of the narrative. He is always above, looking down, descending only when required. The city becomes an arena designed for his visibility. Every surface reflects him back to himself. Cameras do not merely record his presence. They organize reality around it. In this environment, power does not test itself against resistance. It tests itself against its own reflection. The absence that defines this world is subtle but decisive. There is no formative attachment anchoring power to consequence. No early bond that teaches restraint through care. No intimate territory where strength learns its limits by encountering vulnerability. Power is raised in isolation, not as neglect, but as design. Distance is mistaken for purity. Detachment is framed as strength. The result is not emptiness. It is amplification. Homelander is shaped within this vacuum. Not neglected, but observed. Not abandoned, but managed. His early world is not a home, but a laboratory. The walls are clean. The rules are absolute. Affection is conditional, measured, transactional. Praise replaces care. Performance replaces belonging. What grows inside him is not rage at first, but confusion about where meaning resides. He learns quickly that love arrives when the spotlight does. When the spotlight leaves, nothing remains. This is where the tension begins to hum beneath the surface. Power without attachment does not remain neutral. It searches. It expands. It presses outward, looking for a boundary strong enough to push back. In Homelander's world, no such boundary exists. Institutions bend. Crowds cheer. Authority structures orbit him rather than restrain him. The moral center that should counterbalance power has already been outsourced to image management and public approval. The stage itself becomes complicit. Every appearance reinforces the same lesson. He is not required to negotiate reality. Reality adjusts to him. Consequence dissolves under spectacle. The more visible he becomes, the less accountable he is. Visibility functions as insulation. The brighter the light, the deeper the shadow it casts behind him. This is not yet the story of a monster. It is the story of an architecture, a system that confuses control with stability, a culture that mistakes dominance for safety. The language surrounding Homelander frames him as a guardian, a symbol, a reassurance against uncertainty. Yet the reassurance is hollow because it is not reciprocal. He protects nothing he depends on. He defends a territory that does not define him. Inside this structure, identity begins to fracture quietly. Homelander performs certainty while privately circling an absence he cannot name. Without attachment, power has no internal compass. It knows only direction, not purpose. Every act of control is an attempt to feel real. Every assertion of dominance is an experiment in existence. If others submit, then he must be solid. If they fear him, then he must matter. The narrative tension does not arise from external threat. It arises from internal weight. Power accumulates without release. There is no relational gravity to hold it in orbit. It drifts toward extremes because extremes are the only sensations left that cut through the numbness. The smile becomes rigid. The posture becomes performative. The echo of applause grows louder, yet emptier. The world continues to reward him. That is the quiet horror at the center of the opening movement. Nothing pushes back yet. Every system confirms him. Media reframes incidents. Institutions absorb damage. Language is adjusted to preserve the image. What should have been friction becomes lubrication. The machine runs smoother as the moral bearings wear down. Homelander stands on the highest platform of this world, crowned not by tradition or shared memory, but by marketing and fear carefully disguised as admiration. He looks out over a city that reflects him endlessly, yet offers no resistance, no intimacy, no demand that he become more than what he already is. Power fills the space where attachment should have been. Control replaces connection. Surveillance substitutes for trust. The opening does not ask whether he will fall. It asks what happens when nothing holds power in place. When strength is never required to listen. When authority grows without encountering love, limitation, or loss. The monster is not born in a moment of collapse. It is assembled gradually, piece by piece, in a world that believes safety comes from control and never notices what control becomes when it stands alone. Homelander's origin is not defined by tragedy in the conventional sense. There is no single catastrophic loss that fractures an otherwise stable self. Instead, his foundation is shaped by an absence that never announces itself as absence. From the beginning, his world is complete, efficient, and sterile. Every need is anticipated. Every variable is controlled. What is missing is not survival, but meaning formed through relation. He is created inside an institution that understands power as an asset rather than a responsibility. From the first moment, he is less a child than a project. His body is measured. His reactions are catalogued. His emotional responses are corrected rather than understood. There is no shared vulnerability between caretaker and dependent. The relationship is vertical, not reciprocal. He learns early that authority does not respond, it evaluates. This environment produces a specific kind of identity formation. Homelander does not develop a self through mirroring with another human presence. He develops a role. Approval becomes the currency through which he locates himself in the world. The gaze replaces the bond. When observers are pleased, he exists. When they withdraw, he dissolves into agitation. Identity becomes conditional, always awaiting confirmation from outside. The absence of attachment does not leave him empty. It leaves him porous. Without a stable internal anchor, external validation rushes in to fill the space. Praise does not land as nourishment. It lands as proof of existence. This distinction matters. Nourishment strengthens the organism. Proof merely delays collapse. Homelander becomes dependent not on people, but on the reaction they produce. The crowd is not a community. It is a mirror that must never crack. Power enters this structure early, not as temptation, but as baseline. He does not learn power as something to be earned or negotiated. It is simply there, unquestionable, overwhelming, and unchallenged. Strength arrives before empathy. Control precedes understanding. Without attachment, power never learns restraint. It learns only efficiency. The institution surrounding him reinforces this imbalance. Authority figures do not model limitation. They model fear disguised as management. Boundaries are enforced through protocols rather than relationship. Discipline is framed as calibration. Every correction teaches the same lesson. He is not accountable to another human being. He is accountable only to performance metrics. This is where the internal contradiction begins to crystallize. Homelander is elevated as singular, exceptional, irreplaceable. Yet his entire existence is mediated by systems that remind him he is owned. He is celebrated publicly and constrained privately, admired and contained. This produces a tension between omnipotence and captivity that never resolves. He cannot integrate power and dependence into a coherent self. Without attachment, dependence becomes humiliation. Every reminder that he is managed feels like theft. Control exercised over him cannot be metabolized as care. It registers as threat. The seeds of resentment are planted not toward weakness, but toward any structure that limits him. Authority becomes intolerable unless it emanates from him alone. The narrative world amplifies this dynamic through contrast. Around Homelander exist other figures shaped by compromise, negotiation, and partial belonging. They are weaker, more flawed, more contingent. Their power is circumscribed by consequence. They must navigate alliances, fear, guilt, and loyalty. Homelander observes them not as peers, but as irritants. Their limitations offend him because they mirror what he cannot tolerate in himself. The symbolic terrain of the story reinforces this divide. Homelander occupies the center, the throne, the illuminated space. Others exist at the periphery, negotiating shadows and alliances. The architecture of power is literal. He stands above. They cluster below. Space itself encodes hierarchy. There is no shared ground where mutual recognition might occur. Psychologically, this produces a fragile supremacy. Because his identity is externally sustained, any challenge feels existential. Criticism is not disagreement. It is annihilation. Dissent does not register as difference. It registers as betrayal. Without attachment, there is no buffer between self-image and threat. Every fissure becomes a crack in reality itself. The narrative also establishes the role of spectacle as emotional regulation. Media does not merely portray Homelander. It stabilizes him. Carefully edited images, rehearsed speeches, and choreographed rescues function as rituals that reaffirm his existence. When the spectacle runs smoothly, his inner world quiets. When it falters, anxiety surges into aggression. This is not vanity in the superficial sense. It is dependence. The screen becomes his nervous system. Feedback loops replace reflection. Without an internalized other to moderate impulse, external reaction becomes the sole regulator. Power seeks intensity because intensity is the only sensation that breaks through the numbness of omnipotence. The cultural logic of the world supports this trajectory. The public does not demand restraint. They demand reassurance. Homelander is not loved for who he is, but for what he symbolizes. Safety, dominance, national pride. These projections allow him to avoid self-confrontation. As long as the symbol holds, the man behind it remains unexamined. What forms here is a closed circuit. Power feeds image. Image feeds identity. Identity demands more power. At no point does attachment interrupt the loop. No bond introduces friction. No relationship insists on vulnerability. The system moves smoothly toward extremity because nothing slows it down. By the end of these foundations, the conflict is already inevitable. A self constructed entirely through external validation cannot tolerate independence in others. Power without attachment cannot coexist with autonomy. Control must expand to preserve coherence. What begins as management becomes domination. What begins as reassurance becomes terror. The monster is not an aberration. It is the logical outcome of a system that taught power to stand alone and never taught it how to belong. The conflict does not announce itself through rebellion or open collapse. It begins as adjustment, small recalibrations inside a system already tilted toward excess. Homelander's behavior does not initially change in kind, only in degree. The same gestures of control become more frequent. The same assertions of authority grow less patient. What once passed as confidence begins to carry a sharper edge, a pressure beneath the surface that no longer dissipates after applause. Narratively, the first visible fractures emerge when Homelander encounters resistance that cannot be fully edited out. Not opposition in battle, but resistance in meaning. A delay in obedience. A hesitation. A look that does not immediately affirm his centrality. These moments are minor in scale, but massive in implication. For a figure whose identity depends on uninterrupted confirmation, even a pause registers as threat. His response is not yet overt cruelty. It is correction. He tightens control around messaging, around behavior, around proximity. The institution enables this instinct. Advisors manage fallout. Media reframes incidents. The system treats his discomfort as a logistical problem to be solved rather than a warning sign. In doing so, it teaches him that escalation works. Psychologically, this is the stage where power begins to confuse itself with necessity. Homelander no longer experiences control as a choice. It becomes something the world demands of him. If others hesitate, he must assert. If narratives fracture, he must consolidate. Responsibility is inverted. The more he dominates, the more justified he feels in doing so. Aggression is reframed as leadership. The symbolic terrain tightens accordingly. The spaces he occupies become smaller and more fortified. Private rooms, controlled environments, restricted access. While he remains publicly elevated, privately his world contracts. This contraction is not experienced as loss, but as purification. Fewer variables mean fewer threats. Fewer voices mean fewer reflections he cannot manage. His interactions with others reveal the structural shift. Where once he tolerated imperfection as background noise, he now interprets it as defiance. Weakness irritates him not because it endangers outcomes, but because it destabilizes hierarchy. He begins to test limits, not to understand them, but to see if they exist at all. Each test that goes unpunished reinforces the same conclusion. There is no boundary he cannot cross. The narrative events that mark this phase often present as pragmatic decisions, strategic eliminations, calculated intimidations, moments where excessive force is justified through necessity. The language surrounding these acts remains clinical, managerial. Harm is framed as collateral. Accountability dissolves into procedure. What matters is that the system continues to function. Internally, these acts do not bring satisfaction. They bring clarity. Each escalation simplifies the world. Ambiguity recedes. Fear becomes legible. Submission restores coherence. For someone whose internal world lacks stable attachment, clarity feels like relief. The more others fear him, the less he has to question himself. The audience perception shifts here as well. What was once unsettling charm begins to read as menace. The dissonance between image and action widens. Yet this dissonance does not weaken Homelander's position. It strengthens it. Polarization begins to form around him. Supporters rationalize. Critics escalate. Neutrality becomes harder to sustain. This is where mimetic tension quietly enters the structure. Others begin to mirror his aggression, either in resistance or in imitation. Conflict organizes itself around him. Every action pulls the narrative further into orbit. He becomes the gravitational center not because he seeks meaning, but because power without attachment collapses everything toward itself. The institution's failure at this stage is not silence, but complicity through mitigation. Every attempt to soften consequences communicates the same message. He is untouchable. Each reframing protects the symbol at the expense of reality. Over time, Homelander internalizes this protection as entitlement. Not merely to act, but to define what counts as truth. By the end of this phase, the conflict has taken shape. Not as a battle between sides, but as a structural imbalance that can no longer be ignored. Homelander is no longer simply powerful. He is necessary to the system that fears confronting him. The monster has not yet fully emerged, but the conditions that require it are now locked in place. The narrative moves forward under increasing pressure. Control has begun to replace performance. Fear has begun to replace admiration. The system continues to function, but only by narrowing its own moral and psychological margins. What was once a spectacle now feels like a siege waiting for its next escalation. As the system reorganizes itself around fear, the conflict enters a phase where concealment becomes impossible. Homelander no longer relies primarily on image to maintain dominance. Image becomes secondary, a tool rather than a foundation. What sustains him now is the certainty that resistance carries consequences. The shift is subtle in form, but absolute in direction. Power stops asking to be believed and begins demanding to be obeyed. Narrative events escalate accordingly. Incidents that once would have been hidden are now partially exposed, not as failures, but as warnings. Violence becomes less surgical and more demonstrative. It is no longer enough that dissent disappears. It must be seen disappearing. The spectacle changes character. It no longer reassures. It intimidates. The spotlight that once affirmed him now projects a shadow large enough to cover entire territories. Psychologically, this marks the moment when power detaches fully from any remaining need for recognition. Approval still exists, but it no longer regulates behavior. Fear does. This transition matters because fear does not stabilize identity. It amplifies paranoia. Once fear becomes the primary organizing force, power must constantly prove itself or risk collapse. Control becomes compulsive. Homelander's internal world narrows further. He interprets ambiguity as threat, silence as conspiracy, autonomy as betrayal. Without attachment, he cannot tolerate unpredictability in others because unpredictability mirrors the instability he refuses to face within himself. Every independent actor becomes a rival force. Every unscripted moment becomes a challenge to his sovereignty. The narrative reinforces this through repeated confrontations where negotiation fails before it begins. Dialogue collapses into ultimatum. Choice becomes illusion. Characters who attempt compromise are treated not as partners, but as liabilities. The center cannot hold coexistence because coexistence implies limits. Limits imply vulnerability. Vulnerability implies dependence. That chain cannot be allowed to complete itself. The symbolic space shifts from arena to occupied territory. Homelander no longer performs for a city. He patrols it. Surveillance replaces celebration. Presence replaces charisma. He does not need to be loved everywhere. He needs to be felt everywhere. The environment itself begins to reflect this logic. Public space is empty. Private spaces fortify. Trust erodes into compliance. At this stage, the institution surrounding him fractures under the weight of its own strategies. Those who once mediated now retreat or align fully. Ambivalence becomes dangerous. Survival demands loyalty or invisibility. The system produces fewer dissenters not because it persuades, but because it exhausts opposition. Fear is efficient that way. Culturally, the audience perception hardens into camps. Some cling to the original symbol, reframing brutality as strength. Others see the transformation clearly and respond with escalating resistance. What disappears is the middle ground. The narrative world mirrors this polarization. Every action forces alignment. Silence is interpreted as complicity. Homelander responds to resistance not with reflection, but with amplification. He raises the stakes because escalation is the only language left that produces certainty. Each act of dominance temporarily quiets the internal noise. But the relief shortens. The required intensity increases. Power without attachment cannot plateau. It must expand or implode. There is a crucial inversion here. Homelander no longer fears losing power. He fears losing control over perception. Reality itself becomes unstable unless he defines it. This is where truth collapses into authority. Events matter less than the story told about them. Contradiction becomes intolerable. Dissent becomes unreality. The monster emerges most clearly not in moments of rage, but in moments of calm. When he decides, without hesitation, who belongs and who does not. When lives are weighed not against morality, but against narrative convenience. The absence of attachment reveals itself as absence of mourning. Loss does not register as cost. It registers as adjustment. The narrative momentum accelerates here because the system can no longer pretend balance is possible. Every attempt to restore order through moderation fails. The only remaining force capable of confronting Homelander is the chaos his dominance produces. Conflict ceases to be an anomaly. It becomes the organizing principle of the world. By the end of this phase, the transformation is structurally complete. Homelander is no longer defending a symbol. He is enforcing a reality. Power has detached fully from care, from reciprocity, from consequence. What remains is a closed circuit of domination feeding on its own necessity. The story does not pause to ask whether this can be reversed. It moves forward under the assumption that it cannot. The monster no longer needs to announce itself. It has become the system's most stable configuration. The final stage of escalation does not arrive through surprise. It arrives through normalization. What once felt excessive now feels routine. The system has adapted to domination, as if it were climate rather than choice. Homelander no longer needs to test boundaries because there are none left that matter. The remaining structures exist to circulate his will, not to temper it. Narrative events in this phase emphasize inevitability. Conflicts resolve not through confrontation, but through erasure. Opponents disappear from relevance before they disappear from the story. Resistance fragments under pressure, not because it lacks conviction, but because it lacks oxygen. Fear has saturated the environment so thoroughly that coordination becomes impossible. Each actor calculates survival alone. Homelander's presence shifts from episodic to constant. He does not arrive dramatically anymore. He is already there. The sky, the screens, the institutions all carry his imprint. This omnipresence eliminates suspense. What replaces it is dread. The question is no longer what he will do, but when and to whom. Power has ceased to be reactive. It is ambient. Psychologically, this is the point where inner emptiness becomes fully externalized. Homelander does not experience doubt as conflict. He experiences it as irritation. Any reminder of uncertainty is swiftly removed. The internal split between grandiosity and dependency has collapsed into a single posture of dominance. He no longer needs reassurance. He needs alignment. The narrative demonstrates this through moments of casual cruelty, decisions made without escalation of tone, violence enacted without emotional charge. These scenes are chilling precisely because they lack intensity. Power has become bureaucratic. Harm is processed like maintenance. The monster is not screaming. It is administering. Symbolically, the throne becomes a bunker. The crown becomes a weapon. What once elevated him now isolates him completely. Yet isolation does not register as loneliness. Without attachment, there is nothing to miss. There is only the constant vigilance required to maintain supremacy. Control consumes all remaining psychic space. At this stage, Homelander no longer defines himself against enemies. He defines the environment itself. Territory is not defended. It is claimed as extension of his body. Any disruption feels invasive. This produces a reflexive violence that no longer needs justification. Action precedes thought. Thought exists only to rationalize aftermath. The audience within the narrative adapts in parallel. Some internalize submission as safety. Others mythologize resistance even as it fails. What unites them is resignation, the belief that nothing meaningful can alter the structure. Power has achieved what it always seeks in its purest form. Not obedience, but inevitability. The institution that once shaped Homelander is now redundant. It exists as ornament. He no longer needs handlers. He no longer needs narratives crafted for him. The story bends toward him naturally because all competing centers have been removed. Authority has condensed into singularity. This is the critical collapse point. Not a fall, but a lock. The system has stabilized around its most extreme expression. There is no tension left between power and restraint. Only maintenance. Only enforcement. The monster does not destroy the world because destruction would imply loss. Instead, it preserves the world in a state of arrested fear. What remains of Homelander as a person is almost irrelevant. Identity has been fully absorbed by function. He is not choosing domination. He is enacting it because nothing else is available. Power without attachment has consumed every alternative mode of being. The narrative does not crescendo here. It flattens. This flattening is the point. When everything bends the same way, movement ceases to feel dramatic. It feels final. The system breathes through domination. The monster does not roar. It endures. From this position, there is nowhere left to escalate. The conflict has resolved itself into structure. The story moves forward not toward change, but toward analysis of what this permanence means. The aftermath has already begun. Once the conflict stabilizes into structure, its meaning escapes the boundaries of individual narrative and enters the cultural field. Homelander ceases to function solely as a character and becomes a symbolic instrument through which broader anxieties about power, safety, and authority are processed. The story no longer asks what he wants. It asks what kind of culture requires him, sustains him, and continues to make sense of itself through his presence. At this level, Homelander operates as a projection surface. Different groups read him according to their needs, fears, and unresolved contradictions. For some, he embodies reassurance, the fantasy that overwhelming force can substitute for trust. For others, he becomes the embodiment of threat, proof that unchecked power inevitably turns predatory. These readings coexist without resolving, because the symbol is elastic enough to contain both. That elasticity is precisely what gives it cultural durability. The central cultural mechanism at work is polarization. Homelander does not merely divide opinion. He organizes identity around alignment with or against him. To support him is to affirm a worldview where control equals order. To oppose him is to affirm a worldview where power requires constraint. What disappears in this process is the possibility of shared ground. The symbol does not invite dialogue. It demands positioning. This polarization mirrors the dynamics of contemporary visibility culture. In a landscape shaped by constant exposure, figures are no longer understood through complexity, but through amplification. Extremes travel faster. Nuance dissolves. Homelander thrives in this environment because he does not require understanding. He requires attention. The medium itself favors his logic. The more he polarizes, the more present he becomes. Symbolically, Homelander represents the fantasy of invulnerability stripped of intimacy. He is what power looks like when it refuses dependency. In this sense, he functions as a negative myth, not a hero to be emulated, but a figure that reveals the cost of certain cultural desires when taken to their logical end. The desire for absolute safety, the desire for unquestioned authority, the desire to be protected without having to participate. The narrative also exposes how collective identity forms around fear. Communities under Homelander's shadow do not cohere through shared values. They cohere through shared submission or shared opposition. Both forms are reactive. Neither produces genuine solidarity. The story reveals how power without attachment corrodes not only the individual who wields it, but the social fabric that orients itself around it. There is a mythic simplicity to Homelander's image that allows it to circulate widely. He wears the symbols of protection, strength, and moral clarity, even as his actions undermine them. This contradiction is not a flaw in the symbol. It is its engine. The gap between appearance and reality generates endless interpretive energy. Audiences argue not because the meaning is unclear, but because it is too clear to be comfortable. In cultural terms, Homelander channels anxieties about institutions that promise safety while operating through coercion. He embodies the fear that systems designed to protect can become indistinguishable from those that dominate. The narrative does not frame this as a corruption of an otherwise pure ideal. It frames it as a structural risk inherent in any system that prioritizes control over connection. The symbolic language of territory becomes crucial here. Homelander does not simply rule space. He occupies it. His presence defines what is allowed to exist within it. This resonates with cultural experiences of surveillance, ideological conformity, and moral enforcement. The audience recognizes the pattern even when the scale is exaggerated. That recognition is what gives the story its discomforting power. Importantly, the narrative refuses to localize the problem within Homelander alone. The culture that sustains him is implicated at every stage. Media ecosystems that reward outrage. Institutions that trade accountability for stability. Audiences that prefer certainty to complexity. The monster persists because it solves problems people do not want to face directly. Homelander also functions as a distorted mirror of hero mythology itself. Traditional heroic figures integrate power with sacrifice, restraint, and relational obligation. Homelander retains the aesthetics of heroism while stripping out its ethical core. What remains is dominance masquerading as virtue. This inversion forces a reevaluation of what heroism actually requires. The cultural impact lies in how difficult it becomes to dismiss him as fiction. He does not belong to a distant fantasy realm. He belongs to a recognizable symbolic ecosystem. one shaped by branding, spectacle, and managed fear. The discomfort arises because the logic feels familiar. The story does not exaggerate tendencies so much as remove the restraints that usually soften them. In this way, Homelander becomes a cautionary symbol not about individual evil, but about cultural drift. About what happens when societies confuse power with safety and visibility with legitimacy. He endures in the collective imagination because he names something people sense but struggle to articulate. The cost of wanting protection without attachment. By the end of this section, the conflict has fully transcended narrative. It exists as a symbolic pattern, one that continues to operate wherever power is insulated from consequence, wherever authority is severed from care, and wherever fear becomes the primary glue holding a culture together. The legacy of Homelander does not reside in what he destroys, but in what remains intact under his dominance. The world does not collapse around him. It adapts. That adaptation is the final and most unsettling consequence of power without attachment. Structures bend. Language adjusts. Moral expectations lower themselves until survival feels like coherence. The system does not mourn what it has lost because it no longer remembers another way of being. Homelander endures as a fixed point, not a ruler constantly challenged, but a condition constantly managed. His presence reshapes time itself. The future narrows into maintenance. The past is rewritten as inevitability. Change becomes suspect because it implies instability. Stability becomes sacred even when it is built on fear. This is how domination settles into permanence. Psychologically, what remains is not a person but a posture. Homelander no longer struggles with identity because identity has been flattened into function. He is what he does. He does what the system requires. The absence of attachment that once produced anxiety now produces emptiness, so complete it feels like certainty. There is no internal conflict left to dramatize. Only repetition. The aftermath reveals that the monster was never a rupture in the social order. It was its extreme articulation. Every mechanism that once moderated power has either been absorbed or eliminated. Care has no leverage. Empathy has no authority. Without attachment, there is no reason to preserve anything fragile. Strength becomes the only value that survives its own application. Culturally, Homelander persists as a myth of warning rather than resolution. He does not teach through downfall. He teaches through endurance. His story unsettles because it refuses redemption arcs or cleansing collapse. It suggests that systems do not correct themselves simply because they become unbearable. They calcify. They normalize. They train people to live inside distortions as if they were natural laws. The symbolic weight of Homelander lies in how little he changes once fully formed. Growth is not his narrative function. Reflection is not his task. He exists to demonstrate what happens when power is never asked to justify itself to another human being. When authority answers only to itself, it does not spiral endlessly. It stabilizes into something cold and efficient. In the collective imagination, Homelander becomes a reference point, a shorthand for a specific configuration of fear, spectacle, and control. He is invoked not because he is unique, but because he feels recognizable. The myth endures because it maps too cleanly onto lived anxieties. About leaders who promise protection while eroding agency. About systems that demand trust while refusing reciprocity. The aftermath is marked by a quiet erosion of responsibility. When power becomes inevitable, resistance feels naive. Complicity feels practical. People do not stop knowing what is wrong. They stop believing it matters. This is the deepest damage Homelander leaves behind. Not terror, but resignation. Not chaos, but managed despair. There is no catharsis in this legacy. No final reckoning that restores balance. The narrative closes on permanence rather than resolution. Homelander stands not as a villain defeated, but as a condition revealed. A demonstration of what power becomes when stripped of attachment, restraint, and relational cost. What remains is clarity. Power without attachment does not explode. It ossifies. It does not rage forever. It administers. It does not need belief. It needs only time. And in that time, it teaches a brutal lesson. Monsters are not born from excess emotion. They are produced by systems that teach power to stand alone and never ask it to care.